Hello everyone, Marquette coming to you from Vancouver Island. In the last video I had said I would talk about why the interior of BC, or the southern interior, would never join Alberta. That's going to require a lot of depth, so I'm going to leave it for now. Instead, I want to talk about a region of BC that would join Alberta if it could, but it can't, and that's going to be a problem. That place is the Peace River region up in the northeast corner. And the thing about the Peace is that it's not like the rest of British Columbia. You know, most of British Columbia is mountainous, but the Peace is more geographically Albertan. It's actually an extension of the prairie grassland ecosystem. It's not the mountain ecosystem. And culturally, the people are more like Albertans than they are like British Columbians. They don't even operate on the same time zone. They follow Alberta's time zone. Now, whenever there's a misalignment between economics, geography, and culture, there's a high potential for conflict. In the Peace, the geography is Albertan, the people are Albertan, but the economics are fully controlled by British Columbia. That's a misalignment. So, will conflict happen here? Well, possibly. And here's how I think it'll happen. First, Alberta would separate with its current borders, and this would happen out of sheer practicality. If the negotiators for Alberta did something silly like add layers of complexity and say, oh, we want to take a bit of this province and we want to take a bit of that province and we want this and we want that, Ottawa and the other provinces would just walk away from good faith negotiations. It's too complicated, too cumbersome, totally unworkable. So, if Alberta left, it would leave as is. Then, not long after the ink was dried, Alberta would look at the Peace River region and say, we want that. And of course, BC would say, no. And then the trouble would start. So to understand how we would get such a bizarre scenario, we have to go way back and look at two things. One, why the Peace River region came into being in the first place, and then why Alberta would want it and why BC would fight to keep it. The first thing to note is that BC is much older than Alberta. But when the boundaries were being drawn up, it didn't happen all at once. It took about 100 years. You know, the coast was charted early on, roughly 1800 or so. The 60th parallel was agreed upon by the Russians and the British Empire. And in 1846, the 49th parallel became the southern border for British Columbia. So that took care of the north, the coast, and the south, which just left the eastern flank. It was actually fairly easy to mark out until it wasn't. And what I mean is that down by the American border, sort of Montana, the Rocky Mountains rise like a giant wall running roughly north-south. And mountains make great dividing lines, as long as they're simple, which the Rocky Mountains mostly are. The problem is that the farther north you go along the tops of those mountains, the less obvious they become. The geology changes and the land becomes increasingly ambiguous. So by the time you get to the majestic Mount Robson, it just gets really weird. And this is where the Peace River region kind of starts. So this ambiguity complicated things right from the beginning. And it mattered a lot because the Peace River region, and in fact all of northern BC, was really an important area for the fur trade early on. So during the fur trade, people would, travel into the region by going through either York Factory on Hudson's Bay or from Montreal. Either way, it was a really long way to go. Ideally, what would have been better is to connect up with the Pacific Ocean, which it was so close they could almost smell it. But the geography was so convoluted that even though the Pacific coast was so close, they hadn't found a good way to get there. So the first guy to go take a look was Sir Alexander Mackenzie in 1789. And he got so turned around that he ended up at the Arctic Ocean, which would have been a little discouraging. Anyway, he backtracked from the Arctic Ocean, went back across the entire continent, got on a ship, and went back to England. Now, he did get a river named after him, so that was good for him. Anyway, he came back in 1792 and gave it another go. A year later, he popped out on the Pacific coast at Bella Coola. Unfortunately for Mackenzie, the route he discovered turned out not to be a very good one. Too rugged. Other explorers would come later to see if they could find a better route, but they too often got terribly lost as well. So the geography was just so damn confusing that when BC was ready to enter Confederation with Canada in 1871, they still didn't know much more about this area than they had 100 years earlier. Now, they could have done a full survey at that time that might have laid out a border that followed some sort of logical geographic boundary, but it wasn't clear there was a logical geographic boundary. And it wasn't at all clear who was going to pay for it. So they did the next best thing. They used a meridian. BC joined Confederation in 1871 with the 120th meridian as a north-south boundary line. But it was still just an imaginary line on a map at the Foreign Office in London. And so they didn't get out to do a proper survey of actually putting pegs in the ground until 1913. And they didn't even finish until 1955. But that's how BC ended up with this strange triangular bit up in the northeastern corner of the province that it turns out is more like Alberta than it is like BC. But as long as BC was in confederation with Canada, that boundary was hardwired into the agreement between itself and Canada. The one thing no one anticipated back in 1871 was how economically rich this region would become. And we often think of BC as a forestry-dominated province. And in the last provincial budget from 2025, the royalty revenues from forestry were $501 million. But the revenues from natural gas were $576 million. So BC now brings in more from natural gas than it does from forestry. And almost every last penny of that comes from the peace. Just to pile on with the conundrums, BC is also known as a major producer of hydroelectricity. With its recent construction of the Site C megadam, the Peace region is now home to both the largest and the fourth largest dams in BC. Well, there's no way the BC government would ever willingly give up the dams and the gas and simply hand them over to Alberta. If this region didn't matter economically to the BC coffers, and considering that San Francisco is actually closer to Victoria than that northeastern corner, BC would probably just turn to Alberta after separation and say, make us an offer, and then be done with it. But instead, we have this uncomfortable misalignment between economics, geography, and culture. And I don't see how it gets resolved without getting a little messy. Because the other thing that no one anticipated back in 1871 is that as people settled the area and built farms and towns, they interacted more with Albertans than they did with southerly British Columbians. And Albertans and British Columbians have been slowly growing culturally apart for a very long time. They're just culturally different people. Albertans are a warrior people with an underpinning of what sociologists refer to as a culture of honor. And British Columbians tend to be more rule of law people. You can actually see it in the crime data. British Columbians and Albertans commit different types of crimes. Now, if you didn't want to rummage through a bunch of crime data, you could actually just look at the way Albertans drive. They're aggressive. They are an aggressive people. They're a warrior people. So the peace is culturally Albertan, not British Columbian. And if you consider that aggressiveness of Alberta and the tendency of young nations to be rather expansionary, well, then you've got all the ingredients of an independent Alberta that would look at what it wants, the peace, and have a willingness to try and take it. Now, let's hope we're all smart about this, but we also have to be realistic. If Alberta separates BC will become an involuntary exclave that will be forced to end its ties with the rest of Canada. And that's when Alberta and BC will look across at one another, staring over the peace, one eyeing it up as a prize to steal away, and one eyeing it up as the darling it won't let go of without a fight.